Faith to You podcast. I'm Pastor Caleb Schroeder. I'm here with Jason Wick today, and we're starting a new series. We're going to be focusing on what it means to live the truth. We set a 5-year vision last November at our church. We rolled it out, and we said that we want to establish Faith Community as a stronghold of truth in the Antelope Valley. And we talked about 3 ways of doing that: know the truth, live the truth, and share the truth. And so one of the ways that we want to help our community live out the truth of the reality of God's Word is through this podcast. So we're going to be addressing different issues, different ways that we can be living the truth in a world that wants to contradict it, in a world that wants to oppose and oppress it. And so in November, when we rolled this out, one of the passages that we went to was in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16, where Jesus describes his followers as a city on a hill. So I want to read that to you. We're going to just sort of have a little discussion about how to work this out in our lives today. So Matthew 5, 13 through 16 says this: "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt should lose its taste, how can it be made salty? It is no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city situated on a hill cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, but rather on a lampstand, and it gives light for all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven."
So a couple questions. One, we see Jesus using really physical examples for us and saying, you are like this, therefore be like this. And so the first one he says is, you are the salt of the earth. What does he mean by that?
A couple of years ago, Harry Walls from Masters University was at our church. He was preaching on this concept right here. And I love what he said. He said that the first thing about salt is it must be proximate. And I think that as believers, oftentimes we believe that for us to be effective Christians, we need to get out of the world. The reason we believe that is we think that the world out there is somehow going to taint me, that they're going to somehow make me have an evil heart or turn me towards sin. And while we need to be careful that bad company can corrupt good morals, for us to be salt, we need to be present with earth. We need to be actively involved in the community that surrounds us. We can't just run away, hide just in our church and in our homes. And there's a tendency just in our culture to do that. This tendency where we just drive up our driveway into our garage, close the door, and we never engage. Where we stand in the line at the grocery store on our cell phone. Where we go and we barely even acknowledge the people who are waiting on us in restaurants or baristas at coffee shops. We need to be present. We need to be proximate. That's what it means to be salt. But it's not just we're present, because you could have salt that's sitting on something, then this is part of Jesus' point. And it's not effective. It doesn't work. It doesn't help. Why? Because it tastes like everything else. It loses its flavor. So if we lose our flavor, that means that we just seem like nice people. Or we just seem like everybody else. They can't even tell that there's a distinction. So it has to be proximate, but it also has to be distinct. There should be something different about us. Like the Christian life should hit different. So when the world sees us, when they interact with us, they should say, there's something weird about you. There's something strange about you. You stand out in this this dish that I'm eating. If there's salt there, you're going to be able to tell that there's salt there.
So one of the things that we see in at least modern Christian culture is if someone comes to Christ, they start coming to church, they're really excited about church, they get plugged in, they start wanting to serve everywhere, they start befriending everybody, having people in their home, hospitality, and a perhaps concerning stat that we see is that usually for most Christians, a few years after accepting Christ and entering into the church, they've cut off all of their non-Christian relationships. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so there's a danger of finding so much of your life in the Christian community that you lose your ability to actually go out into the world and make disciples. And what I found, the most effective way for me to share the gospel with people is through relationships, is through developing relationships. And so when you lose that, you're losing what I call a fishing hole. So you need to maintain fishing holes. We're supposed to be fishers of men. That means we need to have places that we're going out, we're interacting with the world. Now, I think that our primary relationships should eventually be in the church. And so, when I'm discipling somebody, if they come to me and they still don't have a single Christian friend, I'm going to worry about it on that end too. So I was discipling a guy recently, and he still hadn't connected with anybody in the church, and all the people he would go out and hang out with on the weekend were still all of his non-Christian friends. And I was like, okay, keep those relationships, keep sharing with those people, but you need to get plugged in. You need to be discipled within the church. So there needs to be a balance there, and we need to see our relationships with the world as essential to our evangelism. And that's going to change the way that you interact in that relationship. And sometimes you lose relationships because of that. We can't do anything about that. But we need to be actively pursuing venues where we're interacting with the world. So just a few examples. One is having your neighbors over for a barbecue. Just invite your neighbors over. If that's not something you regularly do, get out there. Springtime is going to be over soon. It's going to warm up. Do a barbecue, invite some neighbors over, get to know them. Let them know about you, who you are, what makes you tick, and just share life with your neighbors. Try to create patterns where you're going to the same places. I know you go to the same taco truck, right? And so you go into the same taco truck. For me, I try to go to the same coffee shop regularly, so that as I'm going there, I get to know the people there. But then you got to take it to the next level where you're actually making connections with them. And you do that, in just the highways and the byways of life. You figure out where are places where I'm connecting with people, and then you connect strategically. And what that means is you're working towards a place where you've earned enough relationship sort of capital that they're going to be open to you sharing the gospel with them. Because they're like, what, I know this person cares about me. A really good way to get there is after a few conversations to say, hey, how can I be praying for you? I'm a Christian. I'd love to pray for you. Most people don't turn that down. Then you got to remember what they said, and the next time say, hey, I was praying about this. How did it go? And as you just invest, and now you've turned the corner on talking about spiritual things, you get to share your faith with them or hand them a Bible and say, hey, I'd love for you to read this. I challenge you to read John, and the next time ask them, hey, we're able to read that Bible I gave you at all. And so we figure out ways to be strategic as salt in the world.
And then the next picture that Jesus uses is lights of the world. The city on the hill cannot be hidden.
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, so salt is proximate and it's distinct. Light, he says, can't be hidden. In other words, the life that God has put inside of you, it's going to stand out. And the way it stands out, he says specifically, as he goes on in verse 16, he says, let your light shine before others so they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven. So they're going to see your works. So the way that your light shines is through your Christian works. And there's specifically Christian works. So these are works that are flowing out of your faith. I have faith in God, and that's going to be manifest in my trusting, in my abject dependence on the Lord right here. And so as trials come, I'm not shaken by those trials. As temptation comes, I don't give in to those temptations. And so there's this distinct light shining where it's not just you're a good moral person, but you actually don't lose your cool. You actually endure trials, and you actually put on display good Christian character because of your faith.
There's a famous quote that talks about, share the gospel and sometimes use words. Is that what you're talking about?
The danger, I think, in believing that is it sort of excuses me from having to talk about my faith. And what it says right here is that your life should shine before men so they turn and glorify your Father in heaven. And so if people see you and you seem like a really upstanding guy and they're really impressed by you, you know who they're going to praise? They're going to praise you. They're going to be like, Jason, man, you're a great guy. I really like you. I think that you have great character. And you have to tell them, it's not me. I remember when I was in college, I had to argue with a friend over this. He's like, no, Caleb, it's you. And I was like, no, it's not. Without God, I wouldn't be like this. But that needs to be on our lips. And so people aren't going to turn from our works to our Father if they don't know who He is. And so verse 16 just sort of presupposes that people know you're doing this because you are a child of God, because you've been adopted into His kingdom. So you need to be careful of what I call the wordless fallacy, that I can share my faith without any words. There's a danger on the other side, though. Right? So the other side of it would be the danger of the word-only fallacy. And so some people are just very upfront and straightforward, and they'll get in there and they'll be like, I'm a Christian. What about you? And they'll be like, you should come to church. You should pray. You should read the Bible. And then their life doesn't back up their witness at all. Like, everybody knows they're a Christian, and they're like, I don't want to be a Christian. Why? Because of that guy over there.
Yeah.
You know, it's unfortunate that people say, oh, you know, I don't want to go to church because Christians are all hypocrites. They get that from somewhere. They get that from people in their lives who are like, I'm a Christian, and I don't have compassion for other people. I'm not tender towards other people. I'm not empathetic towards other people. We should look like Jesus. And we see Jesus moving towards the hurting. We see Jesus with compassion for the lost. We see Jesus sharing the gospel, but then demonstrating that with his life. And as followers of Jesus, our actions, our witness needs to back up our testimony.
So what are some examples of this that we see in Scripture, some commands that we could follow in how to be salt and light in the world?
Yeah, so just in 3 passages I want to look at real quick. First one is this 1 Peter 3:15. It says this, but in your hearts regard Christ the Lord as holy, ready at any time to give a defense to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. So first thing, for us to be effective salt and light, we need to be ready all the time to defend our faith. Now, this was really convicting to me the first time I heard it. I was reading the book Don't Waste Your Life by John Piper. And he said in that book, when was the last time somebody asked you a question about your hope? You know, we focus so much on defending our faith that we forget to live out our faith in a way that makes people ask questions. So before I get to defending your faith, I just want to challenge you. Make sure that people look at you and they say, okay, your hope hits different. Like the way that you are when you're brought into situations where the world would lose hope, you don't. What is it? Why is it that you're still going? Why is it that you're okay when everything's falling apart? Why is it that you're not totally wrecked as you go through this trial? And so you have opportunities because you're being salt and light, but then you need to have an answer. This is where we get the term apologetics, literally from this verse right here. The ability to defend your faith is to give an apologetic for your faith. And that's one of the goals of this podcast, is to help you identify different worldviews out there and how to explain your worldview. I do what I do because this is what I believe. I do what I do specifically because this is what is truth. And so you're going to be able to explain the truth that you're basing your hope on. So our hope with this podcast, as you live out that truth, is that you'll be able to explain that to people. The second passage I want to go to is in Ephesians 2, verses 1 through 5. Paul talks about who we used to be, and he says we used to live according to the ways of the world, according to the ruler of the power of the air, the spirit now working in the disobedient. He says, we too all previously lived among them in our fleshly desires, carrying out the inclinations of our flesh and thoughts, and were by nature children under wrath as the others also. He's describing who we were. And he says who we were is we were a people who just responded to the culture that surrounded us. The way that the culture went, that's how we went. And that's what he's talking about when he says the spirit of the power of the air. This is just the world that surrounds you. This is the air that you breathe. And before we came to Jesus, we did whatever the world did. But now, he says, God, in verse 4, who is rich in mercy because of his great love that he had for us, made us alive with Christ, even though we were dead in trespasses, we're saved by grace. So there's this temptation to fall back into the spirit of the power of the air, to fall back into cultural influences, to allow my sort of brain waves to just match the brain waves of the world that surrounds me. And we need to be actively identifying places where we give back, we sort of fall back into those inclinations in our thoughts. And so we need to identify what are the ways the world thinks that are wrong, and what are ways that I'm thinking sort of the same way. And we need to move away from those. So we need to identify worldly influence. And this is really going to be a focus of this podcast. This is one of the things that's going to make this podcast unique. There's a lot of podcasts out there in the world right now that are saying, oh, look at all the problems, look at the wrong ways they're thinking, look at the wrong things that they're doing, and it just points out there. And that's not helpful really to the church. It's good for us to know how to engage with culture, to know what their problem is, to know that we have the answer to their questions that they're asking. We need to know those questions they're asking. But then we need to point a finger back at ourselves and say, are there ways that we're being influenced by the culture at large? Are there ways that our minds are being shaped by the way the world thinks? And so the last thing that we need to be doing is what it tells us in Romans 12:2, where it says, do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. This is constant. This is progressive. He says to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That renewing, that verb right there, it's present continuous. So this is an active, constant way. I need to check my thoughts. Am I thinking like the world, or am I thinking like a believer who sees God's word as truth? So just continuously renewing our mind. So just 3 things: being ready to defend our faith, identifying worldly influence, and then continuously renewing your mind.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited about the vision and the direction our church is heading in. I'm excited about this podcast series. I know you put a lot of work into it, and I'm excited to be along for the journey.
Yeah, so tune in. We're going to be doing this every single week. Next week, we're going to be talking about holistic truth. And I want to encourage you, remember, the goal of this podcast is to affect how you live. So go out this week and live the truth. Thanks for listening.